Let's stitch out the scallop borders on our Star-Spangled Beauty ladder quilt. For the scallop borders, I will open the folder where I keep all of my files and open the quilting bundle and then the scalloped floral border. This border was made specifically for this quilt. I'm going to be bringing in the 3 by 12 inch design. Now, I had mentioned earlier when I did the side border video that I was going to cut my fabric to 3.5 inches, which is just slightly larger than the size needed. My plan was to use the placement of the scallop border to place the left-hand side of my fabric similar to the side border so that I could line them up, and in the multiple hoopings they would stay even. However, as I've been looking at this design, this is really more like the block by block that we've done for the whole quilt versus a border file. And so let me show you the difference. If I go back to a border file and bring in a file that is similar to the one that I used on the side borders, you can see that when the placement of the fabric is run, and this one was 1.5 inches, which is the exact size that I cut my side borders, and so I placed my fabric right within these side placement lines, and that worked perfectly. Then the next step is the tack down, and you'll notice that that jumps to the inside and tacks down both long edges. And that's what you need for a border because of all the quilting. You don't want it to get puckered, so that needs to be tacked down. And if you note on this file that the tack down and placement are directly on top of each other, they're in the same place. So the tack down doesn't jump to the inside like it does on a typical border. And so if I look at this placement line, again, I was going to use this to place my fabric. That side tack down is in the same place, and so I can't use that to line up my fabric. So I need to treat this more like I have the other blocks. I will cut my fabric to about 4 inches, and it will overhang on this side and it will overhang on this side so that when I do run the tack down, it will catch both the scallop side and the straight side. And I need that for this border because there's of course a lot of quilting and this edge needs to be tacked down. So with that being said, we will pretty much do the same thing. I will put 2 in one hooping just because that's the great thing about software is you can combine the files. And then I will run this like a border because I will need to run this more than once to make up the width of the quilt. And so I just will do it a little bit more like the block by block where the fabric is larger than the placement lines. So I hope all that makes sense. Now, also with that being said, I am also going to run the tack down of the batting, and that is because this is scalloped, and so I need that tack down so that I know where to trim my batting. The other blocks and borders, they were just rectangle squares. They were certain sizes, and so I could skip that step because I could cut it exactly to size. This I do need the tack down so I know where to cut the scallops. So I'm not going to make any changes to the 5 steps. So what I am going to do is Command C and Command V to paste, and I'm going to make a second copy. I'm going to run these just like I did the side borders together to save, stabilizer and save time. And I will color sort because I want them to run at the same time. So I will come to Utility and Color Sort. It's been changed by 5 colors or 5 stops, and I will always select a new view. And now I have one design with all 5 of the quilting steps. And that's what I want for this file. So I will come to File, Save Stitch File As, and name this design. And I am going to call the scallop border A. And I'll tell you why in just a second. I am going to add it to my combined files folder, and I will save it to my USB. Now, the reason I saved that file as scallop border A is because I'm going to make a second file for the remaining width of the borders. Now, I could easily run this file twice to make up enough width for the borders. If you look at the directions or any pictures of the quilt, you'll note that the scallop has 7 scallops on the top and the bottom. If I were to run this file twice, it would be 8 scallops, which is fine. The excess would just run, to the end of your material and then onto the stabilizer. That's really not a big deal, and you could cut what you need. However, they give you multiple sizes in these files, and so what I'm going to do is go back to the original page that has 2 files, and I am going to Command A and just delete those because I just saved that as one file. So now I'll go back to the scallop border, and I'm going to bring in a smaller size, a 3x10 that has 3 scallops. Now I want you to notice that there are 2 different 10-inch, an A and a B, and I'm going to bring those both in to show you the difference. And the difference is which flowers are on the ends. And you can see they're the same quilting, but one design has the smaller flowers on the end with the larger in the middle, and vice versa for the other one. Now, if I go to the borders that I just made, you can see that it starts with the large, small, and then when I do the second hooping, it will continue down here, and so I need the large flower to be the top or the first flower of the 3 scallops. So if I come back, I want to make sure that I have this border so that the flowers continue in that order. So I'm going to select the one that I don't want and hit delete. So I do want to make a copy. I will Command C and Command V. Again, with this border, I am not going to do any changes with the background quilting. I will use all 5 of the steps. So I will just separate these. I still will be using my 9x14 hoop. Everything will be the same other than it will be a different file and only have 3 scallops. So now I can color sort. I'll come to Utility and Color Sort. It's been changed by 5 colors or 5 stops. So I, again, will select a new view. And so I have one file with all of the steps combined. And that's what I want for this next file. So I will come to File, Save Stitch File As, and name my design. I'm going to choose the scallop border A just so I don't have to retype it, and then I will just replace that with a B, and I will again put it into my combined files folder and take that to my USB. So when I run these 2 hoopings, it will be exactly the same as the side borders. I will just have 2 files, one with the 4 scallops. When I'm done with that, I will open the new file with the 3 scallops and then continue. So let's go stitch out these cute scallops. I will come to Embroidery and to my USB and to my combined files folder, and I will choose the scallop border A and hit Set and Embroidery. Now on my 9x14 there's a little space below and above. So I have my roll of stabilizer, which for the scallop border, I am using the No Show Mesh. I ran out of muslin, and since Joann's is no longer, I need to find a different place to get my muslin. So because I'm using the No Show Mesh, I have the whole roll towards the front of my machine versus the back. So I'm going to go to Layout and Move and move this design all the way to the top so that all of the stabilizer that is attached to the roll is towards the bottom. I will select OK and then go to the minus plus needle, and I'm ready to stitch out the placement for the batting. So I have the batting tacked down and trimmed, and I am going to have to make another slight adjustment. I had forgotten that when I cut my piece for the borders, I made it 7 inches. I put the fusible interfacing on the back because, of course, originally my plan was to cut 3.5 inch and line up one edge with the placement line, be a little bit over so that it, wouldn't cause a problem when this was tacking down, but that, of course, didn't work. So I'm still going to try to use these pieces, but I'm not as wide as I want it to be. I'm going to have to be a little bit careful placing these. If this would have been 4 inches, it would have been easy just to, place them and be done. So I have the first hooping of the scallop border, and I just want to note again that the reason I keep my stabilizer, or when I'm using muslin, my strip of muslin attached, is because if you notice that it ends right here, and if I would have just cut my stabilizer to fit my hoop, that would have been about 7 inches that I would have just wasted. Now I can cut it off right where it finished quilting and start using this again. Again, that's totally optional, and it's just something that I always do. So now I'm going to rehoop and run the first few steps with the placement of the batting. I'll place the batting, tack it down and trim it, and run the placement for the fabric, and then we'll see how to set this up for our second hooping. So it says I'm finished embroidering, so I will select OK. Now, if you are just running the same file again, you don't need to do anything. You would just run it and cancel this pattern. Go back to embroidery and to the USB and back to my combined files folder. And this time I will get scallop border B and hit set. Now again, because this is an even smaller file, you can see I have a lot of room up at the top and the bottom. I have my stabilizer again coming off the front or the bottom of my hoop. So I am going to hit embroidery and layout and move, and then move this all the way to the top so that I can save all this that's still attached to the roll. Select OK, and then I always go to the minus plus needle, and we're ready to stitch out the second hooping. So here is the next piece, and so what I've done is I've taken my quilted piece. This is the top of my hoop, and so of course you'll know which way it goes, but it goes to the top of the hoop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this over, and just with the friction pen or pencil or whatever you have, I'm going to mark where the edge of the batting is. And I'm going to mark it on the piece that hasn't been quilted yet. And I did cut my stabilizer right, next to that top, which would be this piece right here. And I'm going to fold it back. It's very similar as we've done other borders. And I'm going to butt this piece of the scallop up with the next piece. And it's right at that fold. And then I can look where this little mark is and shift it down so that it lines up the best it can with this line of the batting. So now I'm going to fold this over, and I am going to take a pin and I'm going to put it right at the very end of the tack down of the piece before it. Put that down, and then I think I'm going to just look in this corner because that's where the tack down is. And I'm going to poke it right in that corner. We've done this with a few other things. And then flip back to make sure that I have these battings butted up together. And I'm a little over and a little over, which is how I want it to be. You can kind of see how close I am to the edge from the tack down to the edge of the fabric. Not a whole lot, so I'm just going to move towards the bottom, find the bottom, and then I'm going to just fold my fabric back and kind of see if I have about that same amount. It's pretty close, so I'm going to call that good. I have a little bit on each side of that rectangle, and I can lift it and I butt it up. So I'm about as good as I can get, and that's all we can ask for. So I am going to tape. And I'll take my pins out, and I am gonna go see how I did. So let's see how we did. Here is the top, and it's probably about as good as I can get it. This one, slight to the right. This one was just a hair to the left. But remember, this is going to have binding, and so as long as they look continuous, I'm good with that. So now let's finish the quilting for these last two borders. Here are the borders done, and I love them. I am so glad, again, that I chose a little bit lighter thread so that it's noticeable. And we have the 7 scallops, and because I chose the correct 3 scallop design, it's just seamless. You looking at it can't tell that it wasn't just done all at one time. It looks great. So we are going to leave these as is. There, you can trim, some of the stabilizer away, but you do not want to do anything else with the scallops right now. This needs to stay the way it is until our backing is on. So these are done as of right now. So let's go back to the side borders and get those put on the quilt. So it's time to get the side borders stitched to the quilt. And the directions say to measure, this is the top of my quilt, to measure in the center of the quilt, down, of course, to the end, and get your measurement, and then cut your border, your side borders to that measurement. So when I measured my quilt, it measured 54 inches. I also, just for good measure, measured the sides both long sides, and luckily mine also measure 54, so I don't have any type of discrepancy from the edges to the middle. If you have, for example, measured and you have one side that's maybe 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch too short or too long, you would still cut your border to whatever the center measurement was. And that's so that if you need to make any adjustments or ease a little bit, if it's, too long or too short, your borders will still measure the same. And so luckily, again, mine measure the same. So what I did on the top where I overhung the fabric is I just marked 1/4 of an inch. I marked the end so you can see that I have about an inch over from where my mark is. And so I'm not going to cut my side borders. I will pin this at the bottom at this mark, pin at the top of this mark, and then just, kind of ease my borders in just in case. Now, with that being said, the side borders, we had to piece 2 strips together. So we have a long width of fabric, and then we pieced the half length of fabric. And it's really, not too noticeable. However, I am going to put this towards the bottom of my quilt. So since this is the top, I'm going to flip so that the full length is, or should I say the seam is closer towards the bottom. You don't have to do that. And then for this one, I will also do the same thing. I will find the seam, and it's right here. And again, it's so inconspicuous, you don't really even have to try to put it at the bottom because you can barely even see it. But here's my seam. So I am going to put this towards this bottom. Now the reason I'm showing you this is because of how I'm going to cut this stabilizer away. So let me kind of move this out of the way so that it's a little bit easier to see, and we'll go over what I'm going to do. So this will be my right border, and this will be my left border, just like here's my quilt. And so, it would be right and left. And this is how I'm going to take care of the stabilizer. On the part of the border that attaches to the quilt, I am going to take out the basting stitches or the tack down of the fabric, and I am going to trim right next to the batting line. That's how I've done it on all of the blocks that the quilting does not go into the seam allowance. And so on this side, this will be my right side. And so this edge will be attached to the quilt. I will take out the stabilizer, which is muslin, right up to that batting line. Now, the outside, which will be this for the right side, I am just going to cut right next to the fabric. I am going to leave the basting stitches in. And so that means, of course, because I'm going to cut this muslin right next to the fabric, I am not going to remove it from the seam. And the reason I am doing both edges different is because this edge on the right side of the quilt, we're looking at it this way, this will be attached to the quilt, that will be taken out. This right side, I'm going to just cut the stabilizer but leave the basting, which then of course would leave the stabilizer in the seam allowance. This will be eventually attached to my binding. And so I don't want to separate and have the muslin out of the seam. I actually want that support when I put the binding on. So then on, that would be the right side. So here is the left side of my quilt. Here is my left border. And so this side, which of course is opposite, because we took this side out of the right side, this side that is closest and will be attached to the quilt will get the basting taken out. And again, the muslin or stabilizer will be trimmed right next to the batting. And again, that's just to help have less bulk in the seams. Some of these blocks have muslin in the seam because of the quilting going into the seam allowance, and you can see some are cut out. So I am going to go ahead and take that out of the side that attaches to the quilt. So then on this left border, if we're looking at it correct, this side again will be taken out and will be sewn to the quilt. This side I am just going to trim next to the fabric. That will keep the basting stitches in as well as the muslin in the seam allowance, and that will just keep it sewn together so it's got a little bit more stability when I go to put the binding on. So that's my next step for these two pieces. Now if you're putting your borders on and you don't care where that seam is because you can't hardly find it, here's mine, then it doesn't matter if you orient them right. You just do one to one side and one the opposite to the other side, and then you just apply it to the quilt. So I hope that makes sense. So I will go ahead and do that, and then I will show you the difference. So I have the first one cut. This goes onto the right side of the quilt, and so this side that will attach to the quilt will be on the left. This is the right border. I have taken all of that muslin out of the seam allowance, and then I have left this as is, and I will go trim this with my rotary cutter to get a nice edge. Scissors would be okay too. Now I did want to note that the reason I didn't do this right when I got done with the borders is because you can see how much fraying, and even though we're getting rid of the muslin, you can see that there's still some, it's very minor, but there is some fraying even though this blue piece of fabric was starched and it has interfacing on the back. And so I just don't do anything until I'm literally ready to sew them on the quilt because of that fact. And here's, you can see all this little blue because we had to handle this, over and over. And so I just feel like trimming them to where they are now and then setting them aside, they might get moved around and get even more fraying. So that's just what I do, and that's why I wait. So again, here is the right side of the quilt for the border. The seam is, going to be towards the bottom, and this will be the left side. So I will take out this inside because the quilt will be, between the two, and then both of these I will just use my rotary cutter and trim right next to the fabric, leaving the basting. All right, let me finish this one up. So I just finished up taking out the batting along the seam line for the left side border, and I want you to notice that on the side that I was going to keep, or that I am going to keep my basting and just trim my muslin, somehow my bobbin didn't catch when this started sewing the tack down. And so up until about right here, this, tack down wasn't attached. So I will still cut my muslin, of course, even with the fabric, it just won't be attached. And the reason I like to keep this attached is because when I'm going to put the binding on, you don't have, a separation. So anyways, if that happens, it's not a big deal. You could always stitch this with the sewing machine if you wanted to. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to trim my muslin where it should be if that, was in, and I'll go from there. All right, so let's get those trimmed up. So I just cut all of this off, and there were a couple of spots that you can see is beyond the fabric, and I made sure that when I was cutting this that I lined up my 1.5 inch, because that's what this finished size is I lined it up as I was cutting because, you know, nothing's ever perfect, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't just go with the fabric. And, you know, in this case, I mean, it's so minimal, but this full width is 1.5, and that's what I need. This will be in the seam allowance, and so it'll be fine. But here is our finished strip with the muslin and the basting cut to the edge. That's still in the seam allowance, the stabilizer. And then on the other side, that will be attached to the quilt, has the basting and the stabilizer out. All right, I'm going to finish up the next one, and then I can get this pinned to the quilt. So when I attach this to the side of the quilt, I will pin again the very beginning and where I marked it at the end, and then I'll pin a couple of other times down, you know, the length, and then I will just add clips kind of in between those pins. I like the pins because they definitely secure the borders. So let me get that done. After sewing on the borders and they look great, I pressed the seams towards the border, and now I'm just trimming off the ends because I didn't trim mine prior. Remember, I just marked and then pinned to the markings. So all I've done is just take a ruler and line up the edge of the top or bottom of the quilt along with the edge of the border, and just use that to square that off. So now I'm ready to mark for the top. So for the borders, the scallop borders, I have removed the stabilizer right next to the batting on the straight edge, so when I seam it to the top or bottom, there will be less bulk in the seams. And then as far as trimming the width, I have measured my quilt, and I measured it in the center as well. That's where they tell you to measure it, and mine luckily measures the same. If I put this and measure the top, mine comes to 20.5 inches. And when I measure the border, and if I measure from the end or the start of this scallop to the end of the last scallop, it is not quite 20.5. It's just a hair under 20. And so I need 1/4 of an inch on each end beyond this, the end of the scallop. And that will just be encased in the binding. When we do sew these on and get ready to do the binding, we will use these scallops as kind of a cut line, and then the binding of course will be sewn 1/4 of an inch in, and so having the edges extend 1/4 of an inch works out fine. So I am going to mark that 1/4 of an inch and pin this to the quilt and sew it. I will press the seam towards the border. I will do this for both borders, and then we will be able to start the binding. the borders, the scallop borders, and I think they look great. Now I just need to trim off the ends. So I am going to just take a ruler and line it up with the edge of the blue on the top and then along the side. And that will give me a square border. Now you can see that just a little we've been working with this, how frayed this muslin is. Remember, we didn't trim this all the way back. I will take care of that when I'm ready to do the binding. Right now, I'm not going to worry about her. It'll just, fray as we kind of work with this. So right when I get ready to put the binding in, I will just cut and get rid of the rest of the little threads. So I will square up all of the ends. Right now, we are not doing anything with the scallops. We don't trim them or do anything with those yet. So I'm going to finish up the edges and we'll start preparing for our binding.